You know I'm all about taking the guesswork out of triathlon nutrition, and today's episode is for the female athlete who's wondering, should I be doing something different with my nutrition when I'm on my period? It's a great question because hormones do shift throughout the month, and that can influence metabolism, hydration, cravings, gut function, and recovery and sleep. But does that mean you need to have a completely different fueling plan? In today's episode, we're going to dive into some of the science, debunk some myths, and as always, I'm going to give you some practical tips to help you feel more in control with your training and nutrition, no matter what day of your cycle you're on. Welcome to the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast, the secret weapon in your ears for triathletes who want to get fitter, faster, stronger, and healthier with evidence-based nutrition. So before we go too much further, let's just take a very quick refresher of the menstrual cycle. There are 4 key phases. We have the menstruation part, typically day 1 to 5, but for people that can vary. It can be 3 days, it can be 7 days. And here our hormones are low. Estrogen and progesterone are quite low. We have our follicular phase, which starts at day 1 and goes to about day 14, where our estrogen levels are rising. Then we have ovulation somewhere in the middle. Textbook, it's day 14, where our estrogen peaks, as well as our luteinizing hormone and our follicle stimulating hormone. And then after ovulation, we have our luteal phase. Textbook, it's day 15 to 28. And here our progesterone levels and our estrogen levels are both elevated. Now, this is an example of a textbook 28-day cycle, but cycle length can vary widely from 21-day cycles up to 35-day cycles. And even at an individual level, they can range each month as well. Now, if you're a visual person like me and you want to make sense of that, what I've done is put a nice little visual of those fluctuations of our hormones during the phases of the menstrual cycle up on my website. If you head to dietitianapproved.com/211, which is the landing page for this episode, you can have a look at that to understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about, say, the follicular phase or the luteal phase and what our hormones are doing at each of those. Now, before we answer the question around whether you need a different nutrition strategy during your menstruation part of the cycle, because I'm a triathlon dietitian, I think we first need to dive into what the research actually finds about performance across our menstrual cycle phases. And I want to highlight 2 of the strongest and recent research in this space, McNulty et al. From 2020 and a new paper that's been published in August 2025 from Schlee. Now, I'm not 100% sure if I pronounced that right, but I'll link the details in the show notes if you want to have a look at that reference. So let's dive into a little bit of the details of that research because I think it's really important to understand, and then we can translate that into what you actually walk away with for your training and nutrition. So first, let's go through a great paper, probably the first of its kind really, where McNulty et al. Back in 2020, so through COVID, where a lot of research wasn't actually happening in the lab, they did a massive meta-analysis on cycle phase and performance. So they conducted this big systematic review and meta-analysis of experimental studies in eumenoric women, which means they are naturally cycling women. They're not taking any form of oral contraceptive or contraceptive that could influence a menstrual cycle. And they looked at papers specifically that measured performance outcomes with at least 2 defined phases of the menstrual cycle. This was one of the most ambitious attempts to combine the literature and correct it for between study variants and just get a general sense of phase effects. In simple language, they found that performance in the early follicular phase, so through that menstrual part, on average, it was slightly lower. But the difference was very small. They used the word trivial and not confidently different from 0. The largest contrast in performance emerged between the early follicular phase versus the late follicular phase. So we're talking here menstruation versus after menstruation. The early follicular phase had the lowest likelihood of being a best performance phase at about 30%, while other phases of the menstrual cycle ranged from 53 to 55%. But, and this is really important when we're looking at research like this, they report really large between study variance. And many of the studies that were included were of quite low quality. Around 42% were rated with evidence being low. So their conclusion was exercise performance might be trivially reduced during that early follicular phase, but general guidelines can't be formed as a result of this research. And at the end of the day, a personalised approach is recommended. Some of the limitations, and a big one, is that their studies did not actually verify hormonal phases of the menstrual cycle using biomarkers. So they're relying on calendar counting, and sometimes there is a misclassification risk of phases when you do that. The average sample sizes of the studies were also quite small. So many studies had between 10 to 20 participants, and so it's underpowered to detect really subtle effects. It's hard to draw really strong conclusions with small sample sizes. There was a lot of heterogeneity or variance in their performance tests, so endurance, strength, power, etc., trained versus recreational athletes, and also in things like the nutritional controls, the training status, and the context. Bear with me for a second, but because the average effect size is small and the confidence intervals cross zero, it's quite plausible that for a lot of the individuals in the research, there is actually no meaningful performance drop in that early follicular phase. So it was awesome to read this at the time through COVID, and it was the first study of its kind, I think, where they're just trying to collect everything that we know about the female athlete so far and see what we know. Now, there's a more recently published systematic review from Schlee from 2025. So let's dive into details of that, because it was a much more selective review and one that wanted to really try and elevate the bar. So let's dive into the study design and what sets this one apart. Unlike a lot of the previous research in the female athlete, Schlee really tried to include studies that had verified cycle phase using serum hormone measurements, which is very cool. So in other words, they're excluding all of those research papers that just relied on calendar estimates of where somebody was in their menstrual cycle. They also search for studies that assess the athletic performance or performance-related physiological outcomes in more than 2 menstrual phases in eumenoric females. 19 studies met the inclusion criteria, and they had a total of 279 participants in all of that combined research. So that gives this paper a much stronger methodological filter, but at the cost of, I guess, much fewer included studies. Some of their key findings: 58% of the included studies, so more than half, reported some significant phase effect in at least one performance or physiology variable. That early follicular phase, again, emerges as a phase of relative disadvantage in several areas. One study found that the early follicular phase was worse for VO2 max outcomes. 2 studies reported early follicular phase disadvantage in peak power outcomes, and submaximal ventilation was lower in some studies. Interestingly, though, maximum and explosive strength, most studies found no meaningful difference across the phases. A few studies reported an improved coordination around ovulation, so mid-cycle, relative to the other phases, but they found medium to high risk of bias, and despite their selection for rigor, scientific rigor, the variability in phases compared, populations, and test types still limits how cleanly you can synthesize these results into clear guidelines. So what this paper adds to the research so far is that It is reinforcing that early follicular phase is frequently implicated in disadvantages for certain metrics, but that is not across the board. It's not replicated across every athlete or participant in the studies. But I also found it really interesting that there was not really any difference between that explosive strength across any phase of the cycle, which gives good support for not everything is impacted, not everything gets shifted thanks to our hormone fluctuations. So when we put the McNulty paper from 2020 with the 2025 paper side by side, there's a few consistent themes that emerge, as well as a lot of nuance. McNulty's meta-analysis pulled from dozens of studies and found that performance in the early follicular phase might be slightly lower on average when comparing that early follicular phase to all other phases of the menstrual cycle. But the authors specifically flagged large variability between the studies, possible misrepresentation of the phase that an athlete was actually in, small sample size, and low evidence quality. Schley really tried to build on that by zeroing in on studies that actually measured hormones to confirm menstrual cycle phase. And in their sample of 19 studies, they found that 58% show a phase effect in at least one metric, although the direction and the magnitude still differ. Early follicular, again, is flagged as that phase with relative disadvantages for VO2 max, peak power, ventilation, but even with more stringent criteria, they did still find a lot of variability, bias, risk, and both of those things are still quite large obstacles to drawing really firm conclusions around the outcomes of this research. So what do we take away from all of that? Neither of those authors suggest rearranging your entire training program or fueling around menstrual cycle phase. Both emphasize that if there is an effect, it is small, it is subtle, and it is likely highly individual. And the limitations with this research at this point in time, we're going to get there. We've got a lot of work to do in this space, but both works really do underscore why we need to be cautious about overgeneralizing the research in female athletes right now. And there are some people drawing very firm conclusions around this research and being very prescriptive, which we're just not there yet. We're starting to see some more information, which can be helpful, but we're not at the point where we can go, all right, in week 1 of our cycle, we need to do this type of training versus week 3 of our cycle, we need to do this type of training. But I think they both still reinforce the need that we need to be personalized around our approach, and tracking things is really important, experimenting and adapting for you as the unique human being and athlete that you are. So now that we've explored some of that research around exercise performance through the menstrual cycle, let's kind of bring it all back to that key question that we started with. Should you fuel differently during your menstruation part of your cycle, during your period? Now, based on everything that we've covered, the hormone fluctuations, the small but maybe measurable changes in our performance, and the mixed research findings, here's the best answer I can give you right now. You might benefit from some small adjustments, but you don't need to overhaul your nutrition plan every month. Here is what I would recommend as an advanced sports dietitian based on the evidence and after working with female triathletes for almost 2 decades. We don't need research to understand and recognize that for some women, that part of the menstrual cycle, you can feel a bit rubbish. You can have low energy. You have a higher perceived fatigue. Your appetite can sometimes dip. Your sensations of pain, bloating, cramping, all of that is obviously elevated. And potentially we might have a slightly increased carbohydrate oxidation rate. If you're a female that is quite symptomatic through that menstruation part, then we know that sleep is also affected. And therefore your recovery is not going to be as great because your sleep is not great. So in this phase, in this part of your cycle, I would recommend please just prioritize your carbohydrate intake. Don't skip it or skimp on it, particularly if training is still happening. Now, I didn't just say binge eat chips and hot chips or barbecue shapes or a whole block of chocolate. but don't pull it right back, particularly if you are still training. Maybe avoid fasted training through these days, especially if you're feeling really flat and tired and fatigued. There's no point burning the candle at both ends. Like, just have some fuel before you train. Make sure your recovery nutrition is dialed. Ticking off the 4 R's of recovery. If you don't know how to do that, that's something I can teach you. So that despite maybe not sleeping well or feeling pretty terrible, that we know we're at least ticking off those boxes in the right way for us. I would also focus all the time for a female endurance athlete, because we're in a high-risk group, but particularly through that menstruation part, make sure you are prioritizing iron-rich food to support extra blood loss and recovery, especially if you are somebody that struggles with quite heavy period flow and or your iron status is poor or low or trending that direction, because that increased blood loss is going to lead to increased iron loss. So if you're concentrating on trying to put that back in and make sure the damage is not so bad from those increased losses, we're focusing on iron-rich foods coming into your period, during, and after. So things like red meat, fortified cereals, legumes, to name a few, and pairing those with some form of vitamin C to help enhance absorption. If you are somebody that struggles with low iron status already, then you need to be making sure you are checking your iron status regularly, at least every 6 months, sometimes even more regularly, depending on how bad it is, and timing those appropriately too, so that you can keep an eye on what is going on. We're not just doing it annually and going, oh, I have no idea what's happening. I want you to be more proactive rather than reactive, because it can take a long time to build your iron status back up. And if you're an impatient triathlete like everyone that I work with, then I know that you won't want to get into such a deep hole, because it's going to take you a long time to get out of it. Now, I just wanted to throw in here that sometimes this menstruation part of your cycle for some women feels completely fine. You don't feel like you have any symptoms, or your symptoms don't affect your life or your training or your nutrition, and nothing changes. So make sure that anything that I've talked about today really comes down to you and your personal response, because your physiology is not identical to the next triathlete. And I'd rather you use some data to guide your strategy rather than just being blind about it all. So track your cycle alongside how you feel. So your energy, your mood, your appetite, any cravings that you've got, any gut symptoms that you might have, performance, and see if you can look for patterns. Then make some small tweaks rather than these huge big overhauls and not really having any idea if things have changed, or if they did, what was the thing that made it change. The research is not in a place that dictates or supports a really rigid eat this in week 1 of your cycle type approach and eat this in week 3 of your cycle type approach. But it does support being aware of your physiology and responding to it far more strategically. And if you're a performance-focused triathlete and you're that way inclined, then that's exactly what we are here to do. A couple of other things to think about through that menstruation phase of the cycle is hydration, bloating, and electrolytes. Hydration can also subtly shift across the cycle, especially in the luteal phase, so after ovulation. Progesterone increases here in the luteal phase, and it is associated with fluid retention, which can cause bloating and a very small rise in your core body temperature. It's only small. It's only about 0.3 to 0.5 degrees Celsius, but it is enough. Depending on the environmental conditions that you live or how you train, then that can sometimes lead to an increased sweat rate, a higher perceived effort, and possibly greater sodium losses. Not going to be wildly different, but maybe slightly. So through your cycle, pay close attention to your hydration plan, particularly during that luteal phase after ovulation, before you actually get your period, especially if you're training in the heat and humidity. You might need to work to dial in your sodium during training, particularly if you're a really salty sweater. And if you are somebody that does feel bloated and you have increased gut symptoms through that phase of the cycle, then that doesn't mean that you stop fueling or stop training, but maybe consider something like lower fiber meals or better tolerated sports nutrition products. I think it's another area that we can be more proactive which at the end of the day is going to make you feel better so you can train stronger. The other thing I want to talk about is cravings, because yes, they can absolutely be real. Binge eating a block of chocolate or a whole bag of peanut M&Ms or a whole box of barbecue shapes, whatever it is, it's not just a lack of willpower. It can be physiologically driven, and it can be linked to the serotonin dips in the late luteal phase, blood glucose instability, as well as emotional fatigue, stress, and poor sleep. So as a sports dietitian, here is how I would handle it. Don't go all in on a whole block of chocolate and call it carb loading. But also don't ignore your body's signals. Lean into those cravings a little bit, but have some strategy about it. Build some snacks that maybe are a little bit higher carbohydrate. Make sure you've got some protein and some fiber there to help with your blood sugar level response and control. And that might help you feel more satisfied and stabilize your energy levels so you're not ending up having massive snackcidents. You could change your snack strategy here and do something like banana and peanut butter, or make some chocolate protein balls or bliss balls, or go yogurt and berries or something like that if you're a sweet craving person. But being prepared with a plan is going to make it easier to stay consistent and feel good and avoid that guilt and binge eating around food. I mentioned it a little bit before, but another common challenge through the menstrual cycle and menstruation is gut symptoms. Bloating, pain, sometimes constipation that comes out of nowhere, sometimes diarrhea that comes out of nowhere. And you're not going insane. These are actually hormone-driven changes that affect your gut motility and water retention. So some suggestions, if this is you, are to, like I said before, choose some lower fiber foods heading into training, particularly before those really key sessions like hard runs. If your gut feels off and you know that through that phase of your cycle you have to chase down a portaloo, or you've got to plan your runs based on where all of the toilet stops are. Stick to familiar foods is another good tip. This is not a time to go out somewhere new and eat a crap load of spicy curry or start trying, say, new gels or something when you know that your gut's going to be a little bit weird. And if your gut does get disrupted regularly, then plan meals around gut comfort, not just if it fits your macros. Because planning for all of that is going to give you control and give you consistency. So let's wrap it up with a little bit of a reality check. We've dived into some research and then we've gone a little bit practical, but not everyone feels the same across their cycle. Some athletes feel absolutely fine, unstoppable, nothing changes. Others feel so flat, so heavy, and get bedridden for multiple days. Either end of the spectrum and everything in between is normal. Just because you're one way or the other does not make you unnormal. But it's also why tracking your cycle alongside your training and how you feel and your symptoms can be a really powerful tool in your tool belt. So start logging how you feel across your cycle. Look for patterns over multiple months, not just individual days or one cycle alone. You need to do it over time. If you need to, make some slight adjustments to your nutrition, to your training load, or your session expectations sometimes based on what you know, not just winging it. Because I think it's really important to be informed in this space about you as your unique unicorn self, because your data matters so much more than a textbook or even a research paper that has high variability in results. I'd be really surprised if we ever got to highly specific female athlete guidelines. I think it's always going to come back down to the individual and equipping yourself with some knowledge and understanding around this so that you can make informed decisions for yourself as an individual athlete. So to bring it all home, do you need to eat differently on your period? Maybe, but not in a radical overhaul everything type way. I think instead it's about knowing you and your body, understanding your cycle, and making some small strategic tweaks when it matters. Whether that is prioritizing carbohydrate or adjusting it very, very slightly, we're not talking a lot, timing your training fuel, doing whatever you need to do to manage your gut symptoms, or simply just giving yourself grace on those days when you're not firing on all cylinders to not go so hard. It's okay. Your physiology is dynamic. And when you learn to work with it and listen and tune into your body, not working against it and constantly fighting and to doing the same thing all the time, then that's really when performance starts to shift. And this is why I always say that nutrition is the fourth leg of triathlon, whether you're male or female. And if you want help dialing in your fueling strategy from someone who actually gets it, who attempts to stay across the ever-evolving research in this space, and who works with women just like you, then come and work with me. Whether you start with my Triathlon Nutrition Kickstart course or you dive deep into the Triathlon Nutrition Academy program, you'll get education and support that you need to set your nutrition up forever. If you want to learn about working with me, head to dietitianapproved.com and explore all of those options. And make sure you check out the show notes for this episode for the reference list, which I'll provide if you do want to get a little bit nerdy. You don't have to figure this out for your own. Get the right A-team in your corner so you can keep kicking goals. All right, that's it from me this week. Thank you so much for listening through to the end, and I'll catch you next week.